I'm really glad to see so many people here for the conference today. And I'm really excited to be back at a Drupal event in Toronto. It's been a long time. And I really wanted to thank Evolving Web for organizing this. Those of you who have been in the Drupal community for a long time might remember Do It With Drupal, which was Lullabot's Drupal conference, I guess a decade or longer ago now. And the little bit I did with that, it is so much work to run a conference, and so I just really appreciate all the effort that they are putting in for giving us a reason to get together and nerd out about Drupal. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Andrew Barry, and my background is in Drupal and PHP and backend software development. I live in Guelph, Ontario, which is a little bit that way, I think. My other technical passion, I should actually mention, if you want to find me, I haven't seen anyone mention Drupal.community yet, but it's a wonderful Mastodon instance that's all Drupal folks just talking about Drupal. It really reminds me of like when I started with Twitter, it was literally at like a DrupalCon when I signed up for that account, and it's great to bring that back. So you can find me there. But my other passion is using home automation with open source software. And if you wish that that's what I was talking about, just come find me after this session, and be glad to talk about it. So for today's session, we're going to talk a little bit about some history with Lullabot's goals in 2021. We're going to take a little bit of a detour into some serendipity, and then we're going to describe what architecture decision records are and why you might want to consider them at your organization. We're going to look at Lullabot's examples and process walkthrough, and finally we'll end up with some reflections. But before we start all that, I just want to put this up in front of you, let it sink into your minds, and try to come back to this as we think about the next slides that come up. Do you remember 2021? I mean, I sort of remember it. We had our first virtual company retreat that January, and Seth Brown, our CEO, did his presentation about where he thought Lullabot should focus for the coming year, and he said we needed to standardize and simplify. Okay, those are two great words. I don't think anyone would ever say, I don't like standardizing, I don't like simplifying. But what did this mean? Well, this meant that we wanted to think about how do we improve knowledge transfer across projects? How do we improve the onboarding experience for new developers? And really it was about giving us more room in our brains to think about the hard unsolved problems for our clients rather than just reinventing the same solutions slightly differently each time. So, as we were discussing and thinking about how we would actually execute on this mission to standardize and simplify at Lullabot, we made a couple observations. So one which was really interesting was that if you're not familiar with Lullabot, we're an agency focused in the world of Drupal, and our team members often, but not all the time, stick together across different projects. And that's because we dedicate our developers to a single project full time. So when a project ends or scales back, there's often a group of people who are sort of coming along together for the ride and bringing what they learned from the previous projects with them. But what this meant was that our best practices were often team-based and not company or project-based. And when I joined Lullabot, it was 25, 30 people, maybe, 10 or 15 engineers at the time. There was one team. There wasn't that many people that you had to communicate with. But now we're 60 or 70 people. We've got multiple teams on multiple big projects, and the way we were working just wasn't working. And what was really interesting that made this a hard problem, I thought, was that when we would interview our team members about different solutions to shared problems they all had great solutions. They were just different, right? It's so much easier when one of those teams says to you, yes, we tried out this module or this architecture and it was super painful. Tell everyone not to do it. Okay, go do the other thing, move on. But when you have multiple good solutions, how do you achieve consensus with your team? So at the time, we were trying to think about how do we solve these problems, and we wondered, is this a problem of communication? Well, think about all the places where written communication may have happened among Drupal teams, Drupal agencies over the last 10 or 15 years. Decisions have been made in all of these forums, just in public and in private, and a lot of them don't exist anymore. I mean, how many Jira projects from 10 years ago do you still have access to reference some decision that you realized would be useful? How many decisions for Drupal were made in IRC in Freenode, where that whole service basically crashed and burned, and maybe there's chat logs out there on the internet somewhere, maybe. Even Slack, it's a free instance for the Drupal community. I can't go back and find something from 6 months ago. And we saw something very, very similar at Lullabot with our projects. We might have had a project from 2012 where there were people who had memories of solving similar problems, but it was hard for us to get the real hard facts about what happened at that time. And of course, this doesn't even consider email or phone calls or all the other different types of places that we might make decisions. Okay, so is this a problem of documentation? Well, if improving our communication won't let us standardize and simplify, I guess that's got to be it, right? So let's think about documentation, right? Maybe who would write it, how would it be maintained, how we know it was effective. And to think about this problem, I'm going to present a real-world request we had from a client of ours a few years back. And they asked us, as we were rolling off a project, to leave them documentation for how to fix their site if it was down. And that sentence was the request. And part of the reason they were asking this is that they'd run out of budget, we were rolling off, they didn't have any technical expertise in-house yet. They knew they needed it, but they hadn't hired and filled those positions. So we had non-technical project managers who were going to be responsible for this website, and they were like, help us. When things go down, we don't know what to do. And think about all the things that can cause a site outage. It could be hosting providers having a bad day. It could be relatively simple deployment gone wrong. It could be general internet issues. Things are broken in their office, and it's just their office is off the internet, not their website. Could be bugs, could be security issues, denial service attacks. Like the problem space is huge. And they wanted something that was understandable by their non-technical PM so they could pass that on to their future technical hires. And we've all had documentation requests that meets this criteria because it doesn't have, in this case we had two audiences. We had that future technical developer who was going to be maintaining the site, but if we wrote for that person, the PMs wouldn't feel confident knowing that we had actually given them something usable. The suggestions we might give to a PM might not be actionable in the same way for a developer or vice versa. And they wanted it in Confluence, which was really just not a great place for us to be writing this documentation, given so many of the steps are tied to code and deployments and technical tasks. So when you think about Lullabot's history, to take this example, this is actually why our previous efforts to standardize and simplify got stuck, because we couldn't figure out how to write documentation in a way that we knew who our audience was, that documentation would stand the test of time, and that it would actually help us achieve our goals. So remember I said this was January 2021? We had such beautiful snow. I remember driving by Glen Eden and Chicopee and Moonstone Mountain State Louis up north, and they were closed. And I was just like, I can't even go skiing because the ski hills are closed. This is painful. And so, kids are at home doing online school. It's both incredibly intense and boring at the same time. So I decided I'm going to pick up a new hobby and work on Home Assistant, which is like this home automation tool. And I had this question of how do I run it on my home server, which doesn't really matter. That's not the point. So, I'm reading the documentation, and I found this great docs that tells you, hey, there's only 2 supported operating systems. That's really useful. And then I'm reading on further down, and I'm really glad I had a screenshot of this because they've rewritten it since then. But you can see it says, make sure it's compliant with ADR 0014. And I was like, geez, this seems like something I should know. Is this like some standard that is out there that I've just never run into? Okay, well, let's click on that. And that brought me, surprisingly enough, out of their static HTML website and into a GitHub repository. And you can see in the upper left, it says architecture. It's in the Home Assistant organization. And this just blew my mind because I was like, okay, I was kind of annoyed, to be honest, because like the way I wanted to run it was not one of those 2 options there. But here was all the context and a decision, and then if you scroll down, it had all the technical implementation details of how to actually match this. And that was wonderful as an end user. I understood why they made this decision, and I went from being annoyed to kind of respecting them for it. So I had to walk up a directory. I couldn't just leave this repository unexplored. And you could see at the top, we've got a couple of different decisions that they made. This was 14, so the earlier ones are at the top, and there's one about what the minimum supported Python version is. One that basically says they don't allow integrations, that's like modules in Drupalese, that do web scraping, meaning where they're scraping HTML and extracting data from them. But this first one at the top, record architecture decisions. What's this? Oh, okay, this is really short. We need a way to record decisions, and we're going to do it this way. That's pretty nice. I wish all decisions were that simple. But then finally, clicking that link took me to this blog post written in 2011. And they reference something outside of open source, outside of home automation, outside of the usual comfort zone of those contributors that was near that first post, or that first, 2019, May 2019. So at that point, it was getting close to a decade old. How many times do you reference a 10-year-old blog post and say, because of what was written there, we're going to follow those best practices? And it was from that blog post that there's this great quote saying that we only want valuable documentation in our projects, not valueless documentation. So I really think, even though it's actually not an architecture decision record, that blog post is like the cornerstone of valuable documentation that someone wrote that people could discover on their own and still find value in. So I've been talking about ADRs, we walked through it, but I should probably explain what it actually is. So it's really just three things. First off, you need context, the reason you need to make the decision. And this is important because how many times have your teams spent days, hours, weeks trying to make a decision on something when some stakeholder gets aware of it and they're like, that's not actually important, right? Like, we don't need to solve this problem. Let's solve this other problem. So the context to help a reader understand why you're making the decision. And then the decision. You need to be clear about what it is. Someone who is just maybe implementing it and doesn't actually have a lot of deep questions might just skip to that section and understand what they need to do. And then this is something that I love about this format, consequences, both good and bad. The idea being you have some research, some background, some context, and a decision. What's that decision going to change, right? Are the effects? In that example of we only support Debian and Home Assistant operating system, might be our users who like using Ubuntu or CentOS or Arch or whatever may choose other software because it doesn't run on their preferred platform. And you could see, you can use that to evaluate the decision later, both good and bad, to see if the consequences that you predicted actually came true or not. There's a couple of things that an ADR is not, though. An ADR is not a heuristic. It's not something that you should read and then have questions about how to follow. You shouldn't be guessing. You might have debate about the decision, about whether it's a good or a bad decision, or whether the decision is still useful in current context. But the actual ADR itself should be straightforward, to the point, do these things. An ADR should have a reasonably long life, months to use, not days to weeks. Because if you expect an ADR to change in 6 weeks, is it really an architecturally significant decision that's worth writing down and formalizing? Probably not. ADR, if you think it's going to change, it's really not a decision. It's more a reflection of the state of your project, and there's other ways to communicate that. Email, meetings, status reports, those sorts of things. But likewise, technology changes, and so do ADRs. That example I gave of the supported Python version earlier that was showing in the list, I think there was a point where the supported Python version was 2.8 and 3, and then it was only 3. The fact is they didn't need to change that decision significantly to reflect the fact that the version number got bumped, right? They do the same thing with the operating system one. You know, it'll be Debian 11 and now it's Debian 12. Doesn't really change the fact that you're expected to be using the latest supported version of Debian. You know, it's not something that someone's going to be really surprised by. But when an ADR is past its time, that's okay. They can become deprecated. You still leave a record that the decision was made, but then you mark it as no longer being in force or as part of your current processes day by day. And you know, ADRs, they document decisions. They shouldn't document how to get started on your project or tasks or in-depth examples of how to install a module or configure a content type necessarily. You know, they document decisions. You've got READMEs and wikis and other places that are much better for those other types of documentation. So, you know, I wondered if maybe ADRs was the jar opener that was going to unstick our standardize and simplify efforts at Lullabot. Like, this just seemed like there was something there. If it could work for one of the largest open source communities, you know, on GitHub, on the internet, maybe it can work for our agency. So we decided to give it a try, and we wanted to get started. And we came up, we really wanted to figure out how we could get practice writing ADRs without getting caught in thorny decisions that there wasn't consensus on. So we came up with the idea of what we called an invisible standard, something that our team was actually already standardized on, but we never said. We never wrote it down. We didn't explicitly tell new hires or new team members or even our clients that these were things that we did. And you know, this was really painful, honestly, for new hires, where they would come in, they might do some work based off of their prior experience at a different agency or at a different company, and have to do some rework as they learned what all these invisible standards were. So our first ADR, anyone here familiar with the environment indicator module? Nice. It's written by one of my coworkers, and we did some investigation, and it was literally installed on every single one of our projects. Great, we should write this down. And so we worked on the decision. We talked about why we're using it. We have documentation for the decision, but I'm going to scroll down just a little bit here. We ended up realizing we don't want to just say use environment indicator and figure out the rest from there. We should say, how do you use environment indicator? How should it be configured so that someone who's starting a new project can just, basically copy and paste their way through the decision and make it work. And so we figured out what colors to use, and this process of just figuring out the colors was actually like 6 weeks of real-world time, because we discovered two things. One was the colors we used on most of our sites didn't actually pass WCAG 2.0 color contrast guidelines. And while most of the time our clients are thinking about the front end, the public side facing of their website, we obviously want to be maintaining accessibility standards on the editorial and developer and a designer side as well, anyone who can see the editorial UI or the administrative UI in Drupal. So our accessibility team worked to figure out what would be good colors for all these different types of environments. Then the other thing we discovered was some of our teams had opposite understandings of what local and live colors should be. So some of those projects had red as the local environment toolbar color, and some of them had red as the you're on production, be very careful color. Can you imagine for someone who's moving between projects, they get that color associated with one of those, and then they're like, hey, I can delete a content type and see what happens for this new feature, and then they realize that they were logged into production somehow? Like, that would be really bad. We were lucky it never actually happened, but going through this process allowed us to realize, like, there was real benefit for us in standardizing these things to just try to prevent, possible mistakes in the future. And so we ended up actually turning this into code in the ADR that you can just copy and paste into settings.php with all those colors already set, based off of different hosting platforms and so on. And you don't have to think about it. You turn it on, you copy paste, you move on. So where are we today? We're getting close to 40 ADRs, which is pretty exciting. This is the homepage for our website for all of the decisions we've made. It's at architecture.lullabot.com. It's completely public. The engineering team today, I would say the majority of our team has participated in at least one ADR, which I think is really great because we didn't want this to be a decision-making process that was top-down, where project managers or directors were saying, "Here's how we build a Drupal website." I want the people actually doing the work to be able to come to consensus and drive those discussions themselves. So here's another example of an ADR that we have. You may not be as familiar with the simple add more module. I really like it. It's, again, something that one of my coworkers came up with. I don't even think it has any configuration. I think it's literally you turn it on, it changes the widget for multi-value fields on node forms so that it's more usable, and that's all you have to do. And it's just things like this were pretty easy for us to realize we can just document it, write it down, and reference it for our future work. Something that we added to some of our ADRs is a section around alternatives. So this was a good example of thinking about when will this ADR no longer be valuable. And there's actually a core issue to fix and improve the widget for multi-valued fields in content forms. If that gets committed and fixed, the module will be literally useless. It'll be like, we'll have to have an ADR that says uninstall simple add more anywhere you see it because it does nothing. But this gives us a breadcrumb where if that actually happens, anyone on our team who sees that and clicks that link and realizes that that issue is closed as fixed or whatever it may be, can come back and say, hey, we need to reevaluate this ADR. But as we know in Drupal, may not happen, may not be a priority of the maintainers or the project, and so we knew it was still worth making the ADR. So I've talked about the ADRs themselves, but what about when coming up with a decision is challenging, right? It turns out that the answer was, back to how do we simplify and standardize, it was both communication and documentation. Because as soon as we got past the invisible standards, we needed to have a good way to have those conversations in a constructive manner. And so when I think about Lullabot at the time, we mostly used Slack for asynchronous communication, which I would say is best optimized for sentences at a time thoughts, where you need a response within a day, and where if it's 500 messages in the back scroll, you probably haven't missed anything useful. We realized that we needed something that was a little more permanent than Slack, a little better at searching, a little more conducive to thinking about paragraphs and laying out rationale. And so we ended up selecting a tool called Discourse, which we call Discuss because that's what we do in it, we discuss in it. And that's where, as soon as someone posts 2 paragraphs in Slack, someone will usually say, like, hey, you should move this to discuss because it's already going to be too much. There's a really neat integration that allows you to either select a range of messages in a channel or a thread and just send it all over to a new discuss post, which is really great because sometimes it starts as sentences and you realize that the can you're opening is a little more full than you realized, and you want to shift the conversation over there. We also have the GitHub issue tracker. That is really focused on basically work to be done in the architecture repository where like either a decision has been made, like we should write an ADR, now someone just needs to do it, or where someone specifically is making a proposal like I think we should write an ADR, not necessarily a broader conversation that may or may not turn into an ADR. So here's an example of that in Discuss. We had a channel called Engineering, and Andy asked, he noticed that Storybook, which is a component library tool, turned on telemetry by default, and wondered, is this something, like, should we be turning this off or should we be leaving it on? What's our policy, if any, on that? And we had a conversation, and at the end of that, if you keep scrolling down, someone says, should this be an ADR? And that was the moment where it was like, okay, let's send it to Discuss, give people who may not see this thread a chance to respond to it in the days and weeks ahead. Here's another one, talking about NPM and Yarn and wondering, should we use one or both of these tools? Do we have to use both of these tools on different projects? In that case, it didn't turn into an ADR. We realized there were reasons for both tools and there wasn't a lot we could do about it. In GitHub, here's an example of an ADR that we actually turned into an ADR. You can see that it's actionable. We had a post on Discuss that we worked through. We got to them and was like, yes, we should do this. Okay, we got a task. Let's write the ADR and get it done. So to accept a Lullabot ADR, we have a couple of additional constraints that other communities, other organizations may not have. First off, we don't accept ADRs that are simply duplicating what upstream communities are already doing. We don't have an ADR that says use Drupal coding standards when writing Drupal modules. We don't have an ADR that says make your website user interface accessible. These are things that are much bigger than how Lullabot approaches building websites. We've had conversations around those and say, no, like the community's already got that covered. We should reference those more well-known, more reviewed, more consolidated documentation, even if it's not actually an ADR. As well, we really want our ADRs to be able to be written as a single title. And our heuristic for that is that if you are an expert in the subject area, you should be able to read the title and understand the decision and not have to read the actual ADR unless you really care. So for example, we have a bunch of ADRs on how to configure Composer. And for anyone who's a back-end PHP developer who feels really comfortable and confident in using Composer, they probably don't need to read those. For example, there's one that says, when you're using the Composer patches library, always copy the patch to your local repository and reference that. Don't reference the patch directly on Drupal.org. As an HTTPS URL. The title's way better than that, I promise. It's way shorter. But, the substance is there. And we want to try to maintain them as scannable documentation as best we can. We also aim to accept ADRs that we expect to be in effect for at least a year. That's, if we have a good feeling that an ADR is going to be deprecated in 6 months, we hold off on it. We don't want to have the weight of that decision holding our teams back and going through all of the the work of gaining consensus and making sure that we're not making any mistakes when there's a good chance it might change. And finally, it should be a baseline for all projects that we start. We often ask ourselves, even if a client was unwilling to pay for this work specifically, would we do it anyways? Or would we turn down work if they didn't allow us to do these things? And there are still times, I'll talk about that in a bit, where it gets a little murky, but at least when we accept the ADR, we should have a strong consensus and a strong understanding amongst our teams that we agree that this is a good way to start a project. A Lullabot ADR is also a list of deciders, and you can see those if you look through the ADRs on architecture.lullabot.com, and we treat that really broadly. It's anyone who participated in Slack conversations, Discuss, phone calls, Hangouts, whatever. And the main reason for that is we want to have a breadcrumb for our future selves 5 years from now. Every company has turnover of some amount, and what would happen if someone was reading an ADR, felt we missed something or there was something that we didn't explain well enough in the context of a decision, and they didn't know who wrote it, who to reach out to? If you have a list of the 5 or 10 people who participated in that conversation, you at least have a chance that they remember it, right? Or a chance that they remember it and say, oh, I agree with you, we should change this, rewrite it, whatever it needs to be done. And it's also because, again, at Lullabot, we feel that a lot of decision making from a technical level is best done by broader groups of people, just like the open source community, and we want to embrace that. We write our ADRs in Markdown and store them in Git, just because Markdown is something everyone is already familiar with. It's easy to use. You don't need to have a static site generator. You can just browse them in GitHub. And in fact, our project-specific ADRs, which I'll talk about in a bit, do just that. We render them. The website you saw is using a Gatsby theme plugin. One of my coworkers wanted to just learn Gatsby and see how it worked out. So that itself is open source. You could actually use it and run your own architecture website privately or publicly if you wanted. And then all of our ADRs are also released under a Creative Commons license. You can download the Markdown source for them and use them as you will. From our perspective, these are decisions that we feel are good ones that are solid for not just for Lullabot, but for the Drupal community at large. And we don't see any reason to keep them private. In fact, for our clients, it's really helpful where if we roll off a project and they want to understand the decision making that was made for a specific feature or change, they can walk back to this public resource and not have to get a broken link. So in late 2021, I actually gave a presentation to the Waterloo Drupal users group about ADRs, and I had this slide. And I mentioned what at the time our next steps were. And so at the time, we'd selected Discourse, but we hadn't used it, and I wasn't sure how it was going to work. And now, 2 years later, yeah, it worked. Discourse is great. If you are a distributed agency or a distributed organization where you feel like you need something a little stronger than Slack for having significant conversations, I mean, Forums just had it right. That's I think the way it kind of really is. We wanted to make the ADRs public, and we got approval from our leadership team to do that, and that has been really successful, I think. We wanted to move from documenting invisible standards to choosing standards for high-cost problems, and we've actually done that. We had a working group at one point about choosing a local development environment solution, because Lullabot has always been very much a bring your own tools, do your own work kind of organization. And so most of our projects were not, here's the exact way you set up your local. It was like you probably know how to do this. So, if you're a Linux laptop user, then set up the site using however you want to do it. If you're a Mac user and you want to use MAMP, that's fine. If you're a Docker user, do that too. We ended up researching and gaining consensus, and we have an ADR where we basically say we use DDEV for all of our local development environment. We've been doing that since, I guess it was late 2021, we accepted that, and it's been going pretty well. And then, ADRs on client projects, we've been doing that as well. Just how I said we don't duplicate ADRs that are in public spaces, or we don't duplicate best practices that are in public spaces, we don't duplicate Lullabot's ADRs into our client projects. There's two cases where they write those ADRs. One is where they have a project-specific implementation decision, like are you using layout builder or layout paragraphs? Great example of something that's very significant to a Drupal website that you'd want to explain why. Or in cases where a client specifically requires us to go against our own ADR. And that has happened very rarely, but occasionally we have a client where they've got technical team members and they might say, we love Lando, that's our choice. We need you to use Lando because that's what our team members are using. And so we would write an ADR describing that decision and why it goes against what we typically do, so that someone new coming into the project can read those and not be surprised. So in 2023, when I wrote this, we had 35, I think we're at 37 accepted ADRs. We only have 2 ADRs that we've deprecated, which I'm really pleased with because it means we've been making decisions that stick. Lots of participants, lots of client projects. We actually started referencing them in sales proposals and upstream issues. You have an RFP and it's asking you what your solution is to a certain problem. It's really nice to be able to just say, we have a decision that we've documented in public here. At Lullabot, at 10 years, you can take 4 weeks as a sabbatical, which I did this summer. And in that time, ADRs were conceived, accepted, and published by the engineering team without involvement from anyone in management. And it was, I thought that was like really sort of like where we wanted to go with this. And there's been some talk about using ADRs in other community projects. There was a blog post about how to document decisions in schema.org blueprints. I really like how they ended up even going really simpler and saying we're just going to have a decisions markdown file where we just write things for now and we can always use ADRs later. It was great. Things I would like to see improved. Oh, we've got a backlog of unreviewed ADR ideas. I'm like, we're so behind on that. We got lots of great ideas that just like, we need some focus on, but work has been busy, so you don't always get to it. And the other side of it is that there's been a slowdown after we had like a real year of just snapping through new ADRs and publishing them. Now new ADRs are being proposed about once every 2 or 3 months, and I don't know if that's okay or not. Like I haven't decided that one yet. And a lot of our ADRs are really focused on backend, Drupal, PHP development, site building, and DevOps. Not as many on the front end. And we have this it's an open question as to, is this a problem of how we're approaching ADRs and who's doing the work on them? Or is this just that front end development is just harder to standardize on because so many designs are just so bespoke and so different? So I'll wrap up with a little bit of advice. If you're interested in this at all, just start writing. That's the first thing you can do. You're not going to make mistakes that are important, and if you do, you change them. Use Markdown and Git because you're doing it already. You don't need to learn another tool. And likewise, take your time because sometimes the best decisions are those where you say, let's all sit with this for 2 weeks and come back and make sure it's a good idea. And if it is, then we'll move ahead with it. So thank you everyone for attending. I'll leave you with this last ADR that I live my life by. And otherwise, if anyone else has questions or comments, I do think we have about 5 minutes. Okay, so 5, great. Perfect. Yeah, you're right. Like, can I steal the web browser on here for a sec? Can I pull up? Yeah, okay. Oh, you know what? We're on separate monitors. That's going to be painful. Never mind. If you go to architecture.lullabot.com, you'll see a pill that has the status of the ADR. And the actual documentation around ADRs says that you should have a proposed status as well. We don't do that because we treat merging a pull request with the ADR as transitioning from proposed to accepted. And we don't publish proposed ADRs publicly. So we have tweaked that a little bit, but especially in an open source project, there is that sort of RFC-ish bit of having a proposal.
Hi, Albert here. I was wondering if you had any resistance from any of your team members to this kind of documentation of ADRs. I've found oftentimes, especially with more junior developers or members of the teams, they kind of don't necessarily have the experience to see the value in this, and they're going to see it as more trouble than it's worth.
Yeah, so I would say there's actually the experience we had was kind of the inverse of that. Our newer team members really appreciated them because they felt like the challenge of onboarding and learning about how to do engineering work at Lullabot was greater than they had expected during the interviewing process and so on. So, I think for a lot of them, even if they maybe brought new perspective or disagreed with it, at least they knew what was expected. The expectations were clear, which I think reduces stress for joining a new team for a lot of people. On the other side was, our team members who had been with Lullabot or in the Drupal community for a long time and, really sort of want that whole ethos of, choose your own tools, have independence and autonomy. And I would say in those cases, we had to talk about like the value, right? We had to have these conversations, right, and involve those people. And in the end, I'd say like anytime people generally like express those reservations, they would end up being on board, right? So the point was like we'd have those discussions before the ADR was actually accepted. And it's just the hard work of managing a team.
I liked your talk about invisible principles. It made me think of there's a standard out there called, it's really a giant governmental standard called TOGAF.
I don't think I'm familiar with it, but if you could tell the audience and I about it, that'd be helpful.
One of it's as sometimes these giant governmental standards, it's really very hard to learn all the different parts. But I started looking at it because it has a lot of value when you actually try to get into it. And one of the things it has is a diagram where you can express the principles.
Mm-hmm.
So some of the foundational stuff is expressing the corporate principles. What principles you use to guide your decision.
Yeah, that's actually, something that actually grounded a lot of our discussions around this is at Lullabot we have our company values, but we also have a specific list of our engineering values. And if you search for those online, you can find them. But they describe how we handle conflicts between different groups, different needs, even different technologies amongst our engineering team at Lullabot. And so a lot of times when there has been not necessarily conflict, but questions like, is this an ADR that is worth accepting? We'll go back to those engineering values and say, does this reflect what we are trying to do as far as our, what we want as far as our engineering decision making goes? And, it's one of those things that I don't think we realized at the time was like a really useful prerequisite to adopting ADRs, but in retrospect, and with your mention of it, I do think it's worth having.
Yeah, definitely. Certainly put me in mind of that. Another thing I wondered is if you looked at any kind of community management softwares that instead of just perform, for example, can't remember the names of all of them, but there's a bunch of different open source projects that are for idea generation and voting, like Rubio is one that I forgot.
Yeah, so a couple of reasons we ended up selecting Discourse. I mean, we are not using it, like we're not really big enough to find community management is where we're at. I think Discourse would call themselves community management. They drive some of the biggest online web presences out there. Once you get used to the user interface, even when it's been rethemed, you realize like, oh, this is a Discourse forum too. Something that I would say also drove us towards it is that it is actually completely open source, even though we are paying for the hosted version because we didn't want to host it ourselves. We like to support open source projects. We've got that escape hatch of, we can literally download the Postgres database and run it ourselves. And we do have a lot of conversations in there that are not about ADRs, design, project management, security, all those sorts of things. I would say we didn't spend 6 months evaluating software. We spent about 2 weeks. And so I know there's a lot out there that we didn't look into, but we really looked at it from the perspective of like getting something in place that gets to the 80% would probably do it.
Okay. I think now we're all great.
I have a question.
Oh,
I'm sorry I missed most of the talk, but this is fantastic that the community are not instead of just exchanging module picks, we're exchanging wisdom picks. Thank you for elevating us to that next level. I looked briefly at the ADR site what it has, and there's 37. How could we just have 37? I could sit down and write
Oh, I mean, I could write 100 too, but would my team be with me when I did it? Right? Like, that's the thing, right? Like, for those of us who, you know, we could have taken this as a very top-down approach. A lot of companies do that, and honestly, they do it successfully. It just, that wasn't how Lullabot is, right? And so, you know, I do think, like, on the one hand, 37 seems like a little, but to me, it also seems like a lot, because when I think about how much time a new hire needs to spend reading those ADRs, they probably spend an hour, 2, right, if they're a front-end or a back-end developer. Probably, you know, a little bit less. We have our PMs read it too when they get hired, but like, that's a big chunk of time to take out of your onboarding week, right? So, I mean, I would say in your case, just start writing, and what I mean by that is get those one-line ideas for ADRs down, and then give them to your team and let them run with it, right? And they'll tell you out of those 100 what's important, what's valuable, and where you totally screwed up.